World leaders get together for an online G20 summit. What did they have to say about COVID-19, the global economy, and climate change? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. The G20 Summit is an opportunity for leaders from the world's largest economies to meet in person and discuss some of the biggest global challenges. But that didn't happen this year because of COVID-19 restrictions. Instead, they connected by video link last weekend at a virtual G20 hosted by Saudi Arabia. The coronavirus pandemic and its fallout were on the agenda, and so was climate change. Officials released a closing statement on Sunday, and we begin with this report from CGTN's Jacob Greaves.
The headline-grabbing pledge from this communiqué is a vow to spare no effort to supply COVID-19 tests, drugs and vaccines fairly and affordable to all people. However, the agreement stopped short of mentioning how they would do this and, perhaps more importantly, how much will be spent. The EU had been pushing for $4.5 billion from the G20 to go towards COVID-19 related medical aid for poorer countries, but there's been no mention of that in the final communiqué. Another announcement from this G20 is the extension of a freeze on debt service payments for poorer countries until mid-2021. The G20 initiative has helped 46 countries defer $5.7 billion in debt payments, but that's short of the 73 countries that were eligible and promised savings of around $12 billion. The G20 has urged private creditors to take part in the initiative. The second day of the summit also saw a climate change discussion. Chinese President Xi Jinping called on the G20 to take a lead when it comes to tackling climate change.
First, we should strengthen our response to climate change. The G20 should continue to take the lead in tackling climate change. We need to follow the guidance of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and push for full and effective implementation of the Paris Agreement. Not long ago, I announced China's initiative to scale up its nationally determined contributions and strive to peak carbon dioxide emissions by 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. China will honor its commitment and see the implementation through.
Whilst most leaders outlined efforts to reduce emissions or target carbon neutrality, current US President Donald Trump took aim at the Paris Climate Accord.
To protect American workers, I withdrew the United States from the unfair and one-sided Paris Climate Accord, a very unfair act for the United States.
Trump's comments, however, come as the projected winner of this month's US presidential elections, Joe Biden, has pledged to rejoin the international accord. Jacob Greaves, CGTN in Dubai.
And to discuss all of this, joining me now from Beijing is Qinduo Xu. He is a senior fellow at the Pangoal Institution, and he's the host of CGTN's Dialogue Weekend. Also with us from New York is Robert Hormats. He is managing director at Tiedemann Advisors and a former U.S. Undersecretary of State. With us too from North Carolina is Klaus Larres. He is a professor of history and international affairs, and he's a commentator on European politics. And joining us via Skype from Providence, Rhode Island, is Vladimir Golstein. He is an expert on Russian politics, and he's chair of the Department of Slavic Studies at Brown University. Welcome to all of you to the show. Qinduo Xu, let me start with you. Of course, COVID-19 was a big issue at the G20 summit. The Chinese President Xi Jinping again focused on the economy and said there needs to be a, quote, global firewall against COVID-19. He also pushed for free trade and the dropping of barriers, economic barriers, that is, overall. What is the main thrust of his message to the G20?
Well, he mentioned, very comprehensively the development of the global economy. Before that, of course, you want to eradicate the virus or stopping the spread of the virus. That's about the vaccine and also the treatment and the study of medicines over there. China has promised to make its vaccines public good, which will be accessible and affordable to developing countries. And then it's really about the global economy or recovery of global economy, because that's closely related to probably will mention this as we introduced about this suspension of debt of the poor countries. So China has agreed to basically cut or suspend $1.3 billion of debt from some of the developing countries China is dealing with. And also beyond that, he also mentioned about strengthening the rule of the UN, the WTO, the WHO. In general, it's I think China has been consistent in supporting multilateralism in terms of rules-based multilateral trading system, in terms of the central role of the UN to deal with international issues, to keep peace and stability in the world, etc. So that's been consistent from the Chinese side in terms of the message. Over the past couple of weeks, a lot of regional and international meetings. President Xi Jinping has been talking about, in general, that message to the international community.
Robert Hormats, this was a G20, of course, like no other, and there was a lot of interest on the role that President Trump would play at this meeting. When he did address other leaders of the G20, he again gave his reasons for pulling out of the Paris Accord. What did you make of President Trump's appearance at the G20 at a time when he's still not conceding the election?
Well, he is in a difficult spot because when you look at the votes being certified state by state, it looks pretty clear at this point that former Vice President Biden will be the next president of the United States, and his views on the Paris Accord and on climate are considerably different from those of President Trump. And I think what President Trump was trying to emphasize is that he did not think the Paris Accords were helpful to American jobs, and he thought that the United States was taking a larger share of the burden than it should. I think Vice President Biden, President-elect Biden, has a different view, and that is that the United States has a responsibility, but that the global climate issue is just that, global. And if it's to be resolved, if CO2 emissions are to be cut substantially, then other countries have to do their share. And I think while the Paris Accord is not perfect, it has the other major economies as participants, and the United States is certainly going to encourage through that medium and others, other countries to do more and to do it more quickly, because the only way we'll bring down CO2 emissions to reasonable levels is if every major country participates, and this is a framework for the U.S. to participate, but also to push other countries to do their share and more, because everyone's going to have to do more if this is to succeed, all countries, particularly big countries like the United States, China, Western Europe, and other countries as well.
Klaus, Larres, of course, there was the big shadow of the COVID-19 hanging over this virtual summit that took place. And of course, one area of concern for the G20 is global access to vaccines. In fact, the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, she raised concerns that poorer countries may miss out on this. Do you think the G20 made any progress on making sure that vaccines will be available to all countries?
Well, this was a summit of good intentions, but I think nothing much has been achieved. It's, of course, always good if leaders get together and exchange information and perhaps push in the right direction. But as far as concrete results are concerned, nothing really has been achieved. Angela Merkel, you're quite right, and also the European Union as such, and many other European leaders are very concerned about the debt ceiling, or the debt ceilings which are increasing all over the world, and they want to have serious debt relief measures implemented. And they're also very concerned that the rich countries are hoarding the vaccines, the forthcoming vaccines don't seem to be prepared to distribute that to poorer countries, like, for example, in Africa. For example, President Trump did not indicate that American vaccines will actually be made available to other countries but the United States. And you can say that the performance of President Trump was clearly quite embarrassing. He hardly participated in the summit at all. He decided to play golf, and then he rallied against the Paris Treaty. So it was all very, very embarrassing. And I think what we learned from this summit is if there is not an American president who is committed to multilateralism, such a summit doesn't seem to lead to any results. So I'm quite hopeful that the next summit, when there is a Biden administration in place, which will be much more multilateral, much more cooperative, that the next summit will actually much more successful. Because it still seems to be the case that we do need American leadership to bang heads together and to get concrete results as such a summit. And President Trump is simply incapable and also unwilling to do that.
Vladimir Golstein, the Russian President Vladimir Putin, he told the G20 gathering that the COVID-19 pandemic could lead to a global economic collapse. He warned about the dangers of poverty, of unemployment, and even social disorder. What kind of efforts would Russia like to see to resolve these issues that he talked about?
Well, President Putin was rather diplomatic. He, on the one hand, he was, stressing the need for cooperation, the need for all this world organization to function, from UN to IMF to trade organization. But he also, made a certain kind of gesture toward President Trump by saying that, yes, individual economies matter and the United States economy matter. It can be the engine which, used to be an engine and can continue to be an engine which will sort of push the whole, world. So that's why he was suggesting that, yes, economic recovery is absolutely important because, first of all, poor countries need jobs as well, and they need economic relief to buy this vaccine. He also stressed that, Russia is willing, Russia, claims to have, he suggested that they have one is already, kind of accepted vaccine, two in the making, and he stressed that it's important to share what we have, think about competition, but also try to sort of, to help. So I think what he tried to accomplish mostly is to sort of give more legitimacy to Russia, because we know Russia is a very interesting situation. Now it's part of certain organizations. Then there's sanctions. There's this. There's that. So he sounded like a player that we are on board with everything, with the United States, Europe, with others, and will contribute as much as we can. So that was kind of his message, that we are one of the players. He didn't suggest that we should be, Russia is like the greatest player. He understands that, the United States and China are much more serious kind of players with much bigger muscle. But that was his kind of, message, that we are one of the guys and will play along.
Qinduo, of course, there was deep concern among leaders from developing countries at the G20 on how they would recover from this COVID-19 pandemic. The whole world's been hit by the pandemic. The South African president, Cyril Ramaphosa, he appealed to other G20 nations to help African nations recover from the impact of COVID-19. Let's listen to what he had to say.
We look to the G20, international partners, and the international finance institutions to work with African countries to help them rebuild their economies. The African Union has proposed several measures, including debt relief in the form of interest payment waivers and deferred payments.
So, Qinduo, we know that China is already looking at debt suspension measures, and the G20, in fact, did agree to freeze debt service repayments for the world's poorest countries. What is China's role in this? How crucial is that role in helping the economies of developing countries recover as well?
Well, that's a good question, and I slightly disagree with the previous speaker for a G20. Basically, without the U.S. leadership, is almost useless. Of course, they are not playing the ideal role to resolve the international problems, the crisis, pandemic crisis. But that's partly due to the situation in the United States. I think in that sense, the role of the World Health Organization should be strengthened instead of being weakened right now. So they can play this leadership role in this area, at least the global health, and also they can play a role of coordinating major powers to contribute and to donate to help basically fill the gap of, we still lack like billions of dollars for the COVAX, I believe, for the distribution of these vaccines, to purchase the vaccines and then distribute it to developing countries. Beyond that, I think global economic recovery is really about, in particular, if you look at African country, is about more trade, it's about more investment. And then you want to have a free flow of people, free flow of goods and the services. So you need a fast-track travel system somehow built regionally or internationally, so people can travel, can come back again, back to normal, sort of, to travel to different places, to do business, to do investment, to do trade. And for China, the role China can play, of course, China can continue its under the Belt and Road Initiative to do more trade, more investment in African countries. At the same time, China is trying its best to develop its domestic market to explore the potential of consumption inside China. So you have, recently there are at least 2 countries already starting to export their natural products to China. Or agricultural products, actually, to be specific, to China. So that is a good beginning. I think, as long as a country, they have their own, strength, they can play their strength and make good use of the China market. China is purchasing a lot of stuff and services, mostly from developed world. But sure, China can do something to help with the developing countries like those in Africa.
Vladimir Golstein, do you want to respond to that? I mean, as Qinduo pointed out there, he has some doubts about the fact whether the US could emerge post-Trump with the Biden administration taking a leadership role in the world.
Well, what we do know is that, this is 21st century, and the role of the United States clearly diminished. It used to be like, unilateral kind of country which tend to dominate things. It's not happening anymore. So we can blame Trump, but he more or less is some kind of a diagnosis of the issue. So of course, some leaders think that with Biden on board, there'll be some kind of unified front, but the reality is that there are new players on the block, China in particular, and of course India and Russia. And I think the shift of power goes to China. And as your previous speaker said, I would agree with him that Chinese have to play much bigger role, and for several reasons. One major reason is that they are kind of on both sides of the fence. They are now like a major economic power, much more powerful than any European country, but they still remember when they were developing country and how they were treated by the dominated West. So that's why Chinese government is pushing for multilateral attitudes, for sort of better free trade, for for treating everyone sort of equally, for sort of involving anyone, because everybody benefits from that, and Chinese in particular, they're more than trade with everyone. So I think this is the shift in power, and it will become obvious to everyone.
Robert Hormats, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, we look at the G20. There have been concerns expressed about this vacuum in international leadership.
Well, understandably, because we've had a president for the last 3 3/4 years who's not really demonstrated any major interest in international leadership or alliances or developing some of the friendships that the United States has developed over many decades. And he's not particularly interested in international institutions, the WTO being an example, TPP being another example, the Paris Accords another example. And I think the previous speakers have made valid points that it is very hard to have multilateralism that works effectively without American leadership. But by the same token, the world has changed a lot, and it can't just be American leadership. American leadership is of critical importance, but we need leadership also, and a lot of cooperation between the United States and China, India, the EU, Japan, and numerous other countries. So what we're going to see, I think, under the Biden administration is more American leadership, but also a recognition that America cannot do it alone, and that collaboration with friends and allies in the G20 and in other groups like the WTO are going to be, and the Paris Accords are going to be critical. So it's going to be a more American-led world than before, but not only an American-led world. It's going to have to be a multilateral-led world, and a lot of other countries are going to have to work with the U.S. And I don't see any quick answers, but I do think that a lot of collaboration is going to be needed very quickly, at least to prevent things getting worse, and to collaborate on vaccines and therapies, and also to deal with the financial overhang of this crisis, which is going to be very severe, very large, and it's going to take a long time to dig out of.
Klaus, Larres, of course, when we look at the legacy of the Trump presidency, we will be talking about the U.S. disengagement from the international arena. There was a headline in the New York Times which talking about the G20 Summit, and that headline said, G20 Summit closes with little progress and big gaps between Trump and allies. How much, Klaus, has the Trump presidency impacted the U.S. role in organizations like the G20?
It has a lot. As the previous speaker, Robert Hormats, just said, and I fully agree, the United States cannot lead the world alone, but an absence of the United States, leaving a vacuum, that does not lead to an increased leadership in global affairs. So it is cooperation and multilateralism which we see. And during the Trump presidency, we did not just have severe difficulties between China and the United States, but even between the United States and the European Union and European states, so-called friends and allies, and that of course was unheard of. And I would expect a much better relationship in the future between these allies, and that also then means that the G20 or the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization, the G7, that in all these fora there will be more constructive relations. The same applies to NATO and many other international organizations. So an absence of the United States can be felt pretty clearly, but of course it doesn't mean that the United States can alone run the world, and no one wants that and no one propagates that. And the Europeans have been talking, particularly French President Macron, he has been talking about strategic autonomy, meaning the Europeans need to become stronger. They need to have more of a world role themselves. That is of course a nice ambition from a European point of view, but it at this stage is kind of unrealistic. And I would say that the future will probably demonstrate a closening of transatlantic relations rather than Europe becoming a world player by itself without the United States. So, but I think the Biden administration will definitely be good for international and global multilateralism and cooperation, both of course with the Europeans, but also with countries such as China and also with Russia. I do expect a reset policy by the Biden administration towards countries such as China and Russia, important countries, and Biden knows that cooperation is much better than animosity and hostility. So I believe that he will embark on a really serious course of cooperation, and hopefully that will lead to some very concrete results.
Vladimir Golstein, do you think there'll be a reset with Russia, with Moscow? Because for the past 4 years, Democrats have been telling us that President Trump was far too close to Vladimir Putin, that he was being manipulated by the Russian president. And they also told us for the past 4 years that President Putin had a lot to do with President Trump's election victory in 2016. What does that reset look like?
Well, this is a wonderful question. I'm sure that the Russians do want a reset, but whether it will happen or not, it's not quite clear. The summit, one more time, highlights the need of cooperation, because the problems which face the world are kind of global, be it coronavirus, be it climate. Basically, we need everybody to be involved and everybody treated kind of with respect and seriousness. This is one movement. Another movement is, we do need, countries need enemies, scapegoat. They need to sort of wrap up fears because they want to build their kind of military industrial complexes and things of that nature. And Russia has been traditionally this kind of play this role. So it all depends. We know that Democrats, recently, for 4 years within the United States, it was Russia, Russia, Russia. Russia is bad. Russia is this. Russia is that. So it will be sort of a serious question. That will be the test, if you wish, the first test of President Biden, where he's going to go with this. Will he be interested in in solving global problems through cooperation, or will he be in some level without Trump's rhetoric, but will he continue the essence of kind of Trumpism, if you wish? America, needs enemies. America needs, succeed at the expense of others. So it remains to be seen. I am not terribly optimistic, just for the very simple reason that Biden gets people mostly from Obama, from Clinton administration. So it has to be seen.
Qinduo, what are your expectations for the United States re-engagement with the international community, with world institutions like the WHO, like the Paris Climate Accord, if Joe Biden is finally declared the winner, if he's certified as the winner in the election?
Well, that will be obviously a welcome a change from the perspective of the United States. I think basically from the Chinese side, China certainly welcomed the re-engagement of the United States because China understands, for example, climate change, this issue, it requires the contribution of every country, in particular big countries like China and the United States. Their rules are indispensable, so they have to do something together to reduce the carbon dioxide. And other areas like WHO, you need China, you need the United States, you need European countries, Russia, India, Japan, etc., to contribute to help solve this problem.
Yeah, Robert Hormats, very quickly, got about a minute left. The Saudis, of course, had hoped that this would be a big moment for them, the opportunity of hosting this G20 summit, to present themselves as a modern member of the international community, eager to move past the scandal and the disgrace of the murder of that Saudi journalist, Jamal Khashoggi, 2 years ago. We all remember that very well. Was this in any way a big plus for Saudi Arabia?
I think it was a positive move for Saudi Arabia. First of all, that they got to host it, which is the first time they have. And second, even though I don't think this summit accomplished a great deal, as other speakers have indicated, it wasn't an environment where you could really accomplish very much, particularly because of the transition in the United States and the fact that the American president is not a particularly strong fan of G20s anyhow.
Yeah.
But I do think that the very fact that it was held and continued, and the Saudis demonstrated support for it, was a positive thing. Not a breakthrough, but move things in the direction where next year there'll be another summit and a different American president and perhaps more progress. But keeping the ball rolling was what the Saudis did, and did well. And now we've got to make some progress next year with a different group of people in Washington.
Right. I'm sorry, but time has caught up with us. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's where we need to leave it. Thanks for joining us on The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu.